An elderly couple bought what neighbors called worthless land for $1,200, but what they unearthed beneath the overgrown weeds would expose a fortune so massive it would make their children who abandoned them come crawling back with apologies they didn't deserve to give. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The Montana winter pressed against the windows like it had something to prove. Inside the tiny rental cottage on the outskirts of Whitefish, Martha and Raymond sat close together in the one room they could afford to heat. The space heater hummed its tired song in the corner, barely pushing warmth past the worn couch where they huddled beneath two quilts and a faded Afghan Martha had crocheted 30 years ago, when her hands didn't shake. Martha was 76, thin as birch bark. With silver hair she still braided every morning out of habit more than vanity. Her hands, once steady enough to catalogue thousands of library books, now trembled slightly when she poured their evening tea. Raymond, 78, sat beside her with his reading glasses perched on a nose that had been broken twice in his youth and never set quite right. His shoulders, once broad from years of carrying surveying equipment through rough terrain, now curved inward like he was protecting something fragile in his chest. They split a can of soup for dinner. Martha ladled it carefully into two bowls, making sure Raymond's portion was slightly larger, though he always pretended not to notice. Crackers, 6 each, counted out on napkins. A slice of cheese divided down the middle with a butter knife that had belonged to Martha's grandmother. This was their routine: quiet, careful, dignified poverty. The television stayed off most nights to save on electric. Instead, they played cards by lamplight, gin rummy and hearts, games they'd been playing since 1967 when they first married. Sometimes Martha read aloud from library books, her voice soft and steady, while Raymond closed his eyes and listened. They'd check out the maximum number allowed, 8 books every 2 weeks, and read them all, some of them twice. Their cottage had 2 bedrooms, but they only used one. The second bedroom door stayed closed, the heat vent sealed with plastic and duct tape. In the kitchen, Martha washed dishes in cold water to save on the gas bill. Raymond patched their clothes with thread and needles, his surveyor's precision making neat, nearly invisible repairs to fraying hems and worn elbows. Neighbors rarely spoke to them. The walkers, people called them, always walking because their 2003 Honda Civic finally died last spring and they couldn't afford the repair. They walked to the library, to the grocery store, to the post office. Always together, moving slow, Martha's hand tucked into the crook of Raymond's elbow. But it hadn't always been this way. 15 years ago, Raymond had been a county surveyor, respected, steady work, decent pay. Martha had worked at the Whitefish Public Library for 32 years, knew every regular patron by name, could recommend the perfect book for any mood or moment. They'd raised 3 children in a modest house on Spruce Street, with a yard big enough for a garden and a tire swing. Raymond hung from the old maple tree. Their oldest, Trevor, had been the first to drift. He'd moved to Seattle after college, got into tech sales, made good money. His visits home grew shorter, his excuses longer. Work conferences, tight deadlines, the cost of flights. By 2010, he'd stopped coming for Thanksgiving. By 2012, Christmas cards became nothing at all. Their daughter Karen followed a similar path. She'd married a dentist, moved to Bozeman, started a family. At first, she'd bring the grandkids every few months, but as her husband's practice grew and their social circle expanded, the visits tapered off. Martha and Raymond's simple life, their second-hand furniture and lack of interest in expensive restaurants, seemed to embarrass her. The invitations stopped. The phone calls grew brief, perfunctory. But it was Michael, their youngest, whose abandonment cut the deepest. Michael had always been the one they thought would stay close, sensitive, artistic, the child who actually listened when they spoke. He'd struggled after high school, bounced between jobs, lived at home until he was 28. Martha and Raymond never complained, never pressured him. They just supported him, quietly, the way they did everything. Then he met Stephanie. She was from money, real money. Her family owned a ranch and a stake in some mining operation up north. Michael changed almost overnight. Suddenly their cottage was too small, too shabby. He started making excuses not to visit. When he proposed to Stephanie, Martha and Raymond were thrilled. The wedding was set for June of 2021. The invitation never came. Martha found out from a Facebook post a neighbor showed her at the library. Photos of Michael in a tuxedo, Stephanie in a dress that probably cost more than Raymond's truck had. The ceremony was at some resort in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Big affair, 200 guests, live band, champagne fountain. Martha had sat very still, staring at the phone screen, at her son's smiling face. The neighbor, uncomfortable, had taken the phone back and muttered something about how kids these days didn't understand family. That night, Raymond found Martha in the kitchen, shoulders shaking, trying to cry quietly so he wouldn't hear. He'd wrapped his arms around her, and they'd stood there in the dark, holding each other the way they had through every hard moment of their 48-year marriage. They never called Michael to ask why. They knew why. They didn't fit the image his new wife's family expected. They were an embarrassment, a reminder of a life Michael wanted to forget. Poor, aging, irrelevant. Raymond lost his job 6 months later. The county was downsizing, and at 75, he was the easiest to let go. Martha had already retired early when the library cut hours, and she'd been forced to choose between her salary and the jobs of 2 younger librarians with families to feed. They sold their house. It wasn't worth much. The market in Whitefish had shifted, and they'd taken out a second mortgage during Karen's college years that they never quite recovered from. After paying off what they owed, they had enough for first and last month's rent on the cottage, some savings, and not much else. Social Security covered the basics, barely. Some months they chose between heating and medication, Raymond's blood pressure pills or Martha's arthritis treatment, the light bill or the phone bill. But they never complained, not out loud. They'd survived the Depression as children, both of them born in the late 1940s to parents who knew hunger and hardship. They'd weathered Raymond's tour in Vietnam, Martha's miscarriage between Karen and Michael, the year Trevor dropped out of college, and they didn't know where he was for 6 months. They'd survived worse. They had each other. Spring came to Montana the way it always did, reluctant and muddy. The snow melted into brown slush, revealing a winter's worth of forgotten things. Martha and Raymond walked to town on a Tuesday morning in early April. The sun was out, weak but present, and the air smelled like wet earth and pine. They stopped at the post office first, then the library, where Martha checked out 3 novels and a book on wildflowers. Raymond carried the books in an old canvas bag slung over his shoulder. They were heading home when they saw the sign outside the county administration building. Property auction. Saturday, 10 a.m. Raymond slowed, squinting at the smaller print. Martha adjusted her glasses and leaned in to read. Various parcels available. Residential, commercial, undeveloped land. All sales final. They'd never been to an auction before. Never had reason to. But something about it caught Raymond's surveyor brain. Land. They'd never owned land free and clear, always mortgaged, always payments. "What if," he said quietly. Martha looked at him. "What if what? What if we could buy a piece of something? Even just a little bit. Something that's ours." Martha squeezed his hand. She understood. It wasn't about building or developing. It was about belonging somewhere, having a stake in the earth that nobody could take away. They showed up on Saturday morning with their savings passbook and a thermos of coffee split between them. The auction was held in a drafty conference room that smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee from the pot in the corner. Maybe 40 people scattered across folding chairs, mostly developers and speculators in clean boots and company logos on their jackets. Martha and Raymond sat in the back, hands folded, watching. The auctioneer was a round man with a booming voice, working through properties fast. Suburban lots went for $30,000, $40,000. A commercial space downtown sold for $215,000. The crowd moved money around like it was easy, like zeros didn't mean meals skipped or medicine rationed. Then the auctioneer's voice changed, got a little tired. Next up, Parcel 47. 23 acres, undeveloped, located approximately 9 miles northwest of town. And here he paused, flipping through papers. Zoning indicates unbuildable due to ground instability and potential historical contamination. Property has changed hands, let's see, 9 times since 1976, with no successful development. A few people in the crowd chuckled. Someone muttered something about a money pit. The auctioneer continued, undeterred. Lots of mature trees, access via old forestry road, being sold as is, no warranties, no guarantees. He looked up. We'll start bidding at $5,000. Silence. 4,000, nothing. 3,500? A man in the third row scratched his ear. Not a bid, just an itch. 3,000? More silence. People shifted in their seats, checked their phones. 2,500. The auctioneer was getting annoyed now. $2,000, folks. 23 acres for $2,000. Martha felt Raymond's hand tighten on her knee. She looked at him. His eyes were fixed on the projection screen showing a grainy satellite image of the property. Dense forest, a clearing in the middle that looked darker than the surrounding trees, like a shadow. Raymond leaned close and whispered, "That depression in the center, that's not natural. Something's under there." Martha studied the image. He was right. The land dipped inward in a way that didn't match the surrounding terrain. 1,500, the auctioneer tried, his voice flat now. "Anyone?" "This is 23 acres, people," a woman in front muttered to her companion. "Cursed land, everyone knows it. Old mining runoff, probably. Or worse." "Worse?" the companion asked. "Bodies," the woman said matter-of-factly, "from the 1800s. Miners, Chinese workers. That whole area is probably a mass grave." Martha's heart clenched. Whether the rumors were true or not, she suddenly understood why the land sat empty for so long. People's superstitions, their fears. $1,000, the auctioneer said, resignation heavy in his voice. "Going once at 1,000. Raymond's hand shook as he raised it. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. "We have 1,000 from the gentleman in the back." Nervous laughter rippled through the room. "Any other bids? Going once, twice?" He waited, hammer raised. Sold for $1,000 to bidder 73. People turned to stare. Martha felt their eyes, their judgment. The old couple who just bought a cursed plot of land they'd never be able to use. Fools. But Raymond stood, helped Martha to her feet, and they walked to the front desk to process the paperwork. The clerk, a young woman with kind eyes, processed their payment. $1,200 total with fees and transfer costs. Martha opened the small zippered bank bag she'd brought and counted out 12 crisp $100 bills. They'd gotten them a week ago from selling her mother's wedding ring at a pawn shop in Kalispell. The ring had been the last valuable thing they owned. The clerk handed them a receipt and a manila folder with the deed. "Congratulations," she said softly. "I hope you find what you're looking for out there." Martha thanked her and tucked the folder carefully into her bag. They walked out into the spring sunlight, past the clusters of people still whispering, still staring. In the parking lot, a man in an expensive jacket approached them. "Hey," he called out, "you folks know that property's worthless, right?" Raymond turned slowly, his surveyor's spine straightening. He didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger. He just said calmly, "That's what people said about us too." Martha hooked her arm through his, and they walked away. They visited the property for the first time 3 days later. A friend from Raymond's old job, Davis, drove them out in his pickup truck. The forestry road was barely passable, overgrown with brush and rutted from runoff. They bounced along for 20 minutes until Davis stopped where the road simply ended. "This is as far as I can go," he said. "You sure about this?" Raymond nodded. "We're sure." Davis looked worried but didn't argue. "I'll be back in 2 hours. You got your phone?" Raymond patted his pocket. Ancient flip phone barely held a charge, but it worked. Martha and Raymond stepped out into the cool shade of towering pines. The air was different here, heavier, older. Thick undergrowth choked the ground, salmonberry bushes and devil's club fighting for space between moss-covered logs. They pushed forward slowly, Martha using a walking stick Raymond had cut from a fallen branch. The ground was soft, spongy with decades of decomposed needles and leaves. Spring birds called overhead, but there was something about the silence beneath that felt intentional, waiting. After about 10 minutes of careful walking, they reached a clearing. Not a natural one. The trees here were younger, thinner, like something had cleared the old growth decades ago and nature was still trying to reclaim it. And in the center, just like Raymond had seen in the satellite image, the ground dipped dramatically. It wasn't a gradual slope. It was a depression, maybe 60 feet across, dropping down 8 or 10 feet below the surrounding forest floor. Moss and ferns covered most of it, but in places, Martha could see something else. Straight edges, corners. Raymond moved to the edge of the depression, careful of his footing. Martha joined him. "This isn't natural," he said, his surveyor's eye tracking lines and angles invisible to most people. "This is collapse. Or burial." Burial. Raymond knelt carefully, his knees protesting. He brushed away moss with his hand, revealing not dirt but brick. Old brick, handmade, the kind from the late 1800s. Martha's breath caught. Raymond moved along the edge, clearing more moss. More brick. A straight line, then a corner, then another line. "This is a structure," he said, voice tight with something between excitement and disbelief. "A building. Buried." But who would bury a building? Raymond sat back on his heels, staring at the depression, someone who wanted it forgotten. They spent the next hour exploring the perimeter, finding more evidence. Fragments of what looked like window glass buried in the soil, a piece of rusted iron that might have been a hinge, and near the eastern edge, almost completely covered by a rotted log, a stone marker. Martha cleared the dirt away with her hands, not caring about the mud under her fingernails. Letters emerged, carved deep into granite. A.H. She traced the letters with one finger. Initials. Raymond pulled out the property deed from his coat pocket, unfolded it carefully. The paper was stiff, official. He scanned the description. This parcel was originally registered as part of the Ashford estate, circa 1872. "Ashford?" Martha whispered. A. H. They looked at each other, then back at the depression hiding a buried building, and something passed between them. The same feeling they'd had the morning they got married, 48 years ago, when they were young and broke and everyone said they wouldn't make it. The feeling that they'd just stumbled onto something bigger than themselves, something that would change everything. Davis honked his horn in the distance, signaling it was time to go. Martha stood, brushing dirt from her knees. Raymond carefully folded the deed and put it back in his pocket. "We're coming back," Martha said. Not a question, a statement. Raymond nodded. "Tomorrow. With tools." That night, in their one heated room, Martha sat at the tiny kitchen table with a notebook and pen. Raymond was already asleep on the couch, exhausted from the walk and the excitement. She'd covered him with both quilts and the Afghan. By lamplight, Martha wrote down everything they'd found. The depression, the bricks, the marker, the initials. She sketched a rough map from memory, marking where they'd entered the clearing and where they'd found the stone. Then she opened her laptop, an ancient thing that took 5 minutes to boot up, and searched. Ashford Estate, Montana, 1872. The results were sparse, but she found a few mentions. The Ashfords had been mine owners, wealthy, influential. They'd built a mansion somewhere in the Whitefish area, but in 1897 the entire family disappeared. 7 people gone without a trace. The property was seized, sold off in pieces. The mansion itself was never found. Historians assumed it had been dismantled, the materials sold off. But Martha stared at her notes, at the sketch of the buried structure, and she knew. They didn't dismantle it. They buried it. The question was why. Over the next 3 weeks, Martha and Raymond became a familiar sight on the old forestry road. Davis drove them out most days, sometimes staying to help, sometimes just dropping them off and returning hours later. They worked slowly, carefully. Raymond brought his old surveying tools, measuring and mapping. Martha brought garden gloves, a small shovel, and endless patience. They cleared brush first, cutting back decades of growth. Beneath the undergrowth, they found more evidence. Old fence posts, rotted but still standing in a perimeter around the depression. Fragments of a stone path buried under inches of soil and moss. And as they dug, carefully removing layers of earth, the building began to reveal itself. First, the roof line. Slate tiles, incredibly still intact under the soil. Whoever buried this had been meticulous, covering it in a way that preserved rather than destroyed. Then, a chimney, brick, solid, emerging from the earth like a periscope from another time. People in town started to hear about what they were doing. Curious locals would sometimes hike out, stand at the edge of the property, and watch the elderly couple with shovels and wheelbarrows, slowly unearthing something impossible. Most thought they were crazy. Waste of time and money, people said at the diner, at the hardware store. That old couple's gonna dig themselves into an early grave out there. But Martha and Raymond didn't hear the whispers. Or if they did, they didn't care. They'd spent a lifetime being dismissed, being overlooked, being forgotten. This, whatever this was, belonged to them. Their land, their discovery, their purpose. On a warm morning in early May, 6 weeks after they'd first seen the property, Raymond's shovel hit something different. Not earth, not brick. Wood, finished wood. He dropped to his knees, brushing soil away with his hands. Martha rushed over. Together they uncovered a section of what was clearly a roof, but more than that. An ornate gable with decorative trim, still bearing traces of dark green paint. "This isn't just a building," Raymond said, his voice shaking. "This is a mansion." Martha sat back, hands pressed to her mouth. They'd uncovered maybe 1/10 of the structure so far, but what they could see was extraordinary. This wasn't some rough mining shack or simple homestead. This was craftsmanship, architecture, wealth, the Ashford mansion, buried, preserved, waiting. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their excavation, Martha and Raymond stood at the edge of the depression, looking at what they'd revealed. Raymond put his arm around Martha's shoulders. She leaned into him, both of them tired to the bone, covered in dirt, hands blistered despite the gloves. "Our children thought we didn't matter anymore," Martha said softly. "Thought we were used up. Finished." Raymond pulled her closer. "Maybe we were just getting started." Above them, stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars that had watched the Ashfords build their mansion more than 140 years ago. The same stars that had witnessed whatever tragedy or conspiracy led to its burial. And now, those stars looked down on 2 forgotten people, 2 people the world had written off, slowly bringing secrets back into the light. One shovelful at a time. The work consumed them in a way neither had experienced in years. Martha woke before dawn each morning, her body protesting but her mind sharp with purpose. Raymond would already be up, studying the hand-drawn maps he'd made, planning the day's excavation strategy with the precision of his surveying days. They couldn't afford contractors, couldn't afford machinery or professional help. So they did it themselves, Two people in their 70s with arthritic hands and aching backs, armed with shovels, wheelbarrows, and a stubbornness that had carried them through 5 decades of marriage. Davis stopped by most mornings, sometimes bringing his teenage grandson to help haul dirt. A few neighbors, curious despite themselves, would show up on weekends with thermoses of coffee and extra gloves. Nobody believed there was anything valuable down there, but there was something compelling about watching two elderly people refuse to give up on something everyone else had dismissed as worthless. Just like themselves, the mansion revealed itself slowly, like a secret whispered across generations. First, more of the roof emerged. Slate tiles fitted so precisely that even after being buried for over a century, they'd barely shifted. Then the Widow's Walk, that distinctive railed platform on top, still intact, its iron railings crusted with rust but structurally sound. As they cleared more earth away from the sides, the true scale became apparent. This wasn't just a large house. It was a Victorian mansion, 3 full stories, with turrets and bay windows and architectural details that made visiting historians stop mid-sentence and stare. Those historians started showing up in the 3rd week. Word had spread through academic circles that something impossible was happening in the woods outside Whitefish. Dr. Helen Chen from the University of Montana drove up with 2 graduate students, cameras and notepads in hand. She stood at the edge of the excavation, her face pale. "This shouldn't exist," she said, "not as greeting or introduction, just statement of fact. We have no records of this structure, no photographs, no building permits, no tax records. It's been completely erased from history." Raymond, leaning on his shovel, wiped sweat from his forehead. Somebody went to a lot of trouble to make sure it stayed that way. Dr. Chen descended carefully into the excavation, running her hands along exposed walls. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Hand-carved stone lintels above windows, decorative corbels supporting the eaves, stained glass windows, incredibly still intact in their frames, protected by the earth that had buried them. Based on the architectural style, she said, this was built between 1870 and 1875. High Victorian, influence of Eastlake style. Whoever built this had serious money. "The Ashfords," Martha said quietly. She'd been doing research every evening at the library, scrolling through digitized newspapers and historical records until her eyes burned. Dr. Chen turned sharply. "You found documentation?" Martha shook her head. "Mostly absence of documentation. The Ashfords owned silver mines, built this estate in 1873, according to one brief mention in a mining journal. But after 1897, nothing. The family vanished. 7 people. Parents, 3 adult children, 2 grandchildren. Gone." "What happened to them?" Martha met her eyes. "That's what we're trying to find out." Over the next month, the excavation became a careful archaeological process. Dr. Chen returned twice a week with students, documenting everything, taking measurements, photographing details. But she made it clear to Martha and Raymond that this was their discovery, their property, their story to tell. By late June, they'd cleared enough earth to reveal the main entrance. And there it was, exactly as Raymond had hoped and feared. A massive iron door, 8 feet tall, set into a stone archway. The door was sealed shut, its surface marked with an intricate lock mechanism unlike anything Raymond had seen before. It wasn't rusted through like you'd expect. Someone had treated the metal, protected it. Whoever sealed this building had intended it to last. Raymond spent days studying that lock. He'd sit on an overturned bucket, reading glasses perched on his nose, examining every detail. The mechanism was complex, requiring not just a key but a specific sequence. 7 keyholes arranged in a circle around a central chamber. Martha brought him lunch and dinner, watched him work with the patience she'd learned over 48 years. Sometimes she'd sit beside him, reading aloud from the historical documents she'd found, piecing together the Ashford story. The family had been controversial, she discovered, James Ashford, the patriarch, had made enemies. He'd testified against corrupt officials in a mining rights dispute in 1896, accused a territorial judge and the county sheriff of taking bribes, of stealing land from smaller prospectors. 2 months after his testimony, the family disappeared. The official story was that they'd fled to Europe with embezzled funds. Ashford was painted as a thief and a liar. His mines were seized, his assets frozen, his name destroyed. But Martha found something else. A diary entry published decades later in a collection of frontier memoirs, written by a woman named Sarah Coleman, wife of a local shopkeeper. The entry was dated August 3, 1900. "They're covering up the Ashford place today. Judge Morrison ordered it done. Said the house carried disease, had to be buried for public health. But everyone knows that's a lie," Sarah Coleman had written in her careful script. "They're burying evidence, burying the truth about what really happened to that family. The judge says it's for the best. Some secrets should stay buried." Martha had photocopied that page, and she read it to Raymond one evening as the sun set over their excavation. He'd looked up from the lock, his weathered face shadowed. "They murdered them, didn't they? The Ashfords. Took everything, blamed them for theft, and buried the evidence." Martha folded the photocopy carefully. "That's what I think." Raymond turned back to the lock with new determination. "Then we're opening this door." He'd been collecting old keys, finding them in the brush around the property. Brass keys, iron keys, some so corroded they crumbled in his hands. But others, protected by the soil's mineral content, had survived. On a Tuesday morning in early July, with Martha standing beside him and Dr. Chen documenting with her camera, Raymond inserted the 7th key. The lock mechanism groaned, metal scraping against metal after more than a century of silence. Something deep inside the door clicked, then clicked again, a sequence of internal tumblers falling into place. Raymond gripped the iron handle and pulled. The door resisted, then suddenly gave way, swinging inward on hinges that screamed their protest. A wave of air rushed out, cold and dry, carrying the scent of old wood and stone and time itself. Martha grabbed Raymond's hand. They stood on the threshold, flashlights raised, staring into darkness that had been sealed since 1903. Dr. Chen whispered something that might have been a prayer or a curse. Raymond stepped inside first, Martha right behind him. Their flashlight beams swept across an entryway that looked like it belonged in a museum. The floor was black and white marble tile, barely visible under a thick layer of dust. A grand staircase curved upward, its banister hand-carved walnut. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, crystal pendants coated in dust but unbroken. Everything was draped in white cloth. Furniture, paintings, even the chandelier. Like someone had carefully prepared the house for a long absence. They moved slowly, reverently through rooms that felt frozen in time. The parlor held a piano, covered but still visible through the thin fabric. Sheet music sat on the stand, yellowed but readable. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. In the dining room, a table was set for 7. Plates, crystal glasses, silver utensils, all beneath protective coverings of cloth. In the kitchen, cast-iron pots hung from hooks. Dishes filled cabinets. A wood stove sat cold and silent. But when Raymond opened its door, he found the ashes of the last fire ever lit in this house. Upstairs, bedrooms told stories of interrupted lives. In what must have been a child's room, Martha found toys. A rocking horse, hand-painted with careful detail. Porcelain dolls arranged on a shelf, their glass eyes staring through the dust. Toy soldiers lined up on a windowsill as if awaiting orders. She touched the rocking horse gently, setting it in motion. It creaked softly, the sound obscenely loud in the thick silence. Raymond found her there, tears streaming down her face. "They had children," she whispered. "Babies. And someone took all this away from them." In the master bedroom, the bed was made with military precision. More covered furniture. A vanity with hairbrushes and perfume bottles still arranged on its surface. everything waiting for people who would never return. Raymond was walking the perimeter of the room, his surveyor's instincts active even here. He stopped near the far corner, knelt down, and knocked on the floor. The sound was different, hollow. "Martha?" he called softly. She joined him, watching as he rolled back the oriental rug. Beneath it, barely visible in the dust, was a seam, a trapdoor. This lock was different, newer, the metal brighter, less ornate. Raymond studied it, running his fingers along the mechanism. "This wasn't installed in 1873, he said. "This is later, maybe 1910s, 1920s. "So someone came back," Martha said, "after the house was buried." Raymond nodded slowly. "Came back and added this. Why?" There was only one way to find out. What happens next will not only reveal why this house was buried, but will uncover a secret worth more than anyone in their small town could imagine, and remind us that sometimes the people who are cast aside are the ones who find what everyone else overlooked. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Raymond worked on that lock for 3 hours. His knees ached from kneeling on the hard floor. His hands cramped. Martha brought water and sandwiches from their cooler, sat beside him offering light and quiet encouragement. Dr. Chen had left to teach an afternoon class, but promised to return the next day. They were alone in the buried mansion, in a bedroom that hadn't seen living souls in over 120 years, trying to open a door to secrets someone had desperately wanted to keep. The lock was a 7-pin tumbler, advanced for its era. Raymond used a set of old lock-picking tools he'd inherited from his father, who'd been a locksmith before becoming a farmer. His hands remembered the feel of it, the patient pressure, the listening for internal clicks. Finally, just as the afternoon sun began to slant through the dirty stained glass windows, something gave. The lock opened with a sound like a sigh. Raymond sat back, breathing hard. Martha squeezed his shoulder. Together they lifted the trapdoor. It was heavy, reinforced with metal plates on the underside. Beneath it, a ladder descended into darkness. Raymond tested the first rung carefully. Solid. The ladder was steel, not wood. Modern, relatively speaking. Definitely not original to the house. "I'm going down," he said. Martha didn't argue, just handed him the strongest flashlight they had. He descended slowly, counting rungs. 8, 9, 10. His feet touched stone floor. He stepped back, shining light around what appeared to be a vault. The walls were cut stone, professionally done. The ceiling was reinforced with steel beams, no moisture, no mold, completely dry. "Martha!" he called up, his voice strange in the enclosed space. "You need to see this." She climbed down carefully, Raymond steadying her at the bottom. When she turned and saw what the flashlight revealed, her hand flew to her mouth. The vault was roughly 20 feet square, and it was filled with steel trunks. Dozens of them, stacked with military precision along 3 walls. Each trunk was labeled with numbers in white paint. Raymond moved to the nearest one, number 1, and found it unlocked. The lid lifted with a creak of old hinges. Inside, stacked in neat bundles, was cash. Old bills, the kind you saw in museums, some dated from the 1880s, some from the 1890s, all remarkably preserved in the dry air of the vault. Martha moved to trunk number 2. More cash, but also something else. Gold coins. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, glinting in the flashlight beam. They moved through the trunks methodically, opening them one by one. Bearer bonds, stock certificates from companies long defunct, land deeds to properties across Montana, Wyoming, Colorado. Jewelry boxes filled with diamonds, pearls, emerald brooches, pocket watches made of gold and silver. Silverware by the crate, real silver, tarnished but intact. Trunk after trunk, wealth beyond comprehension. Wealth that should have been found, catalogued, distributed over a century ago. Wealth that had been hidden so completely that the world forgot it existed. They sat on the stone floor, surrounded by open trunks, the magnitude of it crushing down on them like the weight of all that earth above. Raymond's voice shook when he finally spoke. "How much do you think this is worth?" Martha just shook her head. She couldn't even begin to calculate. Millions. Tens of millions. Maybe more. In the far corner of the vault, separate from the trunks, Martha noticed something else. A small wooden desk, and on it, a leather-bound journal. She stood, legs unsteady, and walked over. The journal was thick, its cover embossed with initials. J.A. James Ashford. She picked it up carefully, the leather cracking slightly under her fingers. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was strong, confident. The date, January 1st, 1895. Raymond joined her, and together they flipped through pages of daily entries. Business dealings, family events, descriptions of dinner parties and mining operations. A life documented in ink that had faded to brown but remained legible. They turned to the last entry. The handwriting here was different, shakier, urgent. The date, March 14th, 1897. Martha read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've been betrayed. Judge Morrison, Sheriff Ketchum, even my business partner, Thomas Sullivan. They're coming for everything. I thought truth would protect us. I testified honestly about the bribes, the stolen claims, the families ruined by their greed. But truth means nothing when power wants you silenced. They're coming tonight. I can see their torches from the window. Sarah Coleman sent her boy to warn us, bless her brave heart. We have perhaps an hour. I've done what I can. The cash, the bonds, the deeds, all of it hidden below. Let them take the house. Let them take our lives if they must. But they won't take what I've built for my children and grandchildren. Time will decide who deserves it. Time and whoever has the courage to dig for truth. If you're reading this, stranger, then you've done what others were too afraid to do. You've looked where you were told not to look. You've worked when others said it was worthless. God forgive them for what they're about to do. And God bless whoever finds this and brings the truth back to light. James Malcolm Ashford, March 14th, 1897. Martha's hands trembled so badly that Raymond had to take the journal from her. They sat there on the cold stone floor, the truth settling over them like snow. The Ashfords hadn't fled, hadn't stolen anything. They'd been murdered, and their murder had been covered up by the very men who'd committed it. The house had been sealed and buried to hide evidence. And the stolen wealth, the fortune that Judge Morrison and Sheriff Ketchum and Thomas Sullivan thought they'd taken, had been hidden right beneath their feet all along. For 127 years it had waited in the dark, waiting for two people the world had forgotten. Two people who knew what it felt like to be dismissed, discarded, erased. Two people stubborn enough to dig through doubt and superstition to find the truth. Raymond's arm wrapped around Martha's shoulders. She leaned into him and they cried. Not from joy at the wealth, though that was overwhelming. They cried for the Ashfords, for James and his family who'd been murdered for trying to do right, for the children who'd never grown up, never played with those toys again, for a truth that had been buried so thoroughly that history itself had forgotten it happened. They cried for themselves, too, for the years of struggle, the loneliness, the abandonment by their own children, for every time they'd been told they didn't matter, weren't important, should just fade away quietly. And they cried because somehow, against all odds, two forgotten people had uncovered the biggest secret their town had ever kept. The sun was setting when they finally climbed out of the vault, out of the mansion, back into the evening air of the Montana forest. They'd locked everything back up, sealing the trapdoor, closing the iron door to the mansion. Davis was waiting by his truck, concern written on his weathered face. "You two okay? You've been in there for hours." Raymond looked at Martha. She looked back at him. Some silent communication passed between them, the kind that only comes from 5 decades of marriage. "We're okay," Martha said. But we need to talk to a lawyer. Davis raised his eyebrows but didn't push. On the drive back to town, as the forest rolled past in deepening shadow, Martha stared out the window and thought about her children. About Trevor in Seattle, Karen in Bozeman, Michael with his new wife's family. They'd cast their parents aside as embarrassments, as burdens, as people whose lives were over and done. But Martha and Raymond's lives weren't over. They were just beginning to find their purpose. And that purpose was bigger than money, bigger than revenge, bigger than anything they'd imagined that morning. They'd scraped together $1,200 to bid on worthless land. They were going to tell the Ashford story. They were going to expose a 127-year-old murder and cover-up. They were going to restore a legacy that powerful men had tried to erase. And yes, they were going to claim what legally belonged to them. Not because they were greedy, but because James Ashford had meant for someone to find it, someone who deserved it, someone who understood what it meant to be robbed of dignity, of recognition, of basic human respect, someone exactly like them. In her lap, Martha held a photocopy she'd made of James Ashford's final journal entry. She read the last line again, her finger tracing the words. God bless whoever finds this and brings the truth back to light. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket, right next to the property deed that had cost them everything they had. Outside the truck window, stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars that had witnessed a family's murder. The same stars that had watched their house be buried and their names destroyed. And the same stars that now looked down on two elderly people who'd refused to stay forgotten, who'd dug through a century of lies to find truth waiting in the dark. Raymond reached over and took Martha's hand. His grip was strong despite the day's exhaustion, despite 78 years of living. What do we do now? He asked quietly. Martha squeezed back, her voice steady. We do what James Ashford asked. We bring the truth back to light. All of it. And whatever came after, whatever challenges or dangers or complications arose from unearthing $265 million and a conspiracy that had stayed hidden for over a century, they would face it together. The way they'd faced everything for 48 years. The way forgotten people always did, by refusing to disappear. Martha and Raymond didn't sleep that night. They sat at their tiny kitchen table, the space heater humming in the corner, a single lamp casting shadows across walls that suddenly felt too small for what they carried. The photocopy of James Ashford's journal entry lay between them, weighted down by 2 coffee mugs. Neither had touched their coffee. It had gone cold hours ago. What do we do? Raymond finally asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. We can't just walk into a bank with trunks full of gold coins and 1880s cash. Martha shook her head slowly. We need help, legal help. But who? They sat in silence, both thinking the same thing. Who could they trust with a secret this massive? In a town this small, word traveled faster than wildfire. One wrong person, one careless conversation, and they'd have treasure hunters, criminals, or worse descending on that property. Raymond rubbed his face with both hands. Davis knows something's up. He saw how shaken we were. Martha considered this. Davis had been good to them. Former surveyor like Raymond, retired now but honest, solid. But even good people talked, especially about something this extraordinary. There's got to be someone outside Whitefish, Martha said. Someone who doesn't know us, doesn't know the town gossip. She pulled her ancient laptop over and started searching. Lawyers specializing in estate law, inheritance disputes, found property. The results were overwhelming, mostly big firms in Billings or Missoula that would charge hundreds per hour just to listen. Then she found something different. A small practice in Kalispell, 40 minutes away. The website was simple, almost plain. Morrison and Associates, Estate Law and Probate Services. But it was the photo that caught her attention. A young woman, maybe early 30s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense expression. Sarah Morrison, attorney at law. Below her credentials was a single line, serving clients others overlook. Martha clicked on the About page. Sarah Morrison had grown up poor in eastern Montana, first in her family to attend college, worked her way through law school at night while holding down 2 jobs. She'd started her practice specifically to help people who couldn't afford the big firms. "People like us," Martha whispered. Raymond leaned over to look. "You think she'd take us seriously?" "Only one way to find out." Martha sent an email at 3 in the morning. She kept it vague. "Elderly couple needs legal advice regarding found property and potential estate claim. Time-sensitive matter. Complete discretion required." The reply came at 7:30 that same morning. Sarah Morrison could meet them that afternoon at 2. They took the bus to Kalispell, couldn't risk asking Davis to drive them again without explaining. The ride took 90 minutes, stopping in every small town along the way. Martha clutched her canvas bag containing photocopies of the property deed, the journal entry, and a few photographs they'd taken of the vault's contents. Sarah Morrison's office was above a hardware store on Main Street. They climbed narrow stairs, Raymond pausing twice to catch his breath. At the top, a simple door with frosted glass. Morrison and Associates stenciled in black letters. The waiting room was small but clean. Mismatched chairs, magazines from last year, a reception desk currently empty. They sat holding hands until a door opened and Sarah Morrison stepped out. She was younger than her photo suggested, with her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a blazer, boots that had actually seen work. Her handshake was firm. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker, come on in." Her office was cramped but organized. Law books lined one wall, a desk covered in neat stacks of files, 2 chairs that looked more comfortable than anything Martha and Raymond owned. Sarah gestured for them to sit. "So," she said, settling behind her desk, "found property and estate claims. Tell me what's going on." Raymond looked at Martha. Martha looked back. Then she opened her canvas bag and pulled out the property deed. "6 weeks ago, we bought 23 acres at a county auction for $1,200. It was considered worthless, unbuildable, cursed according to locals." Sarah glanced at the deed, nodding. "We started clearing brush," Martha continued, "and we found something. A building, buried deliberately. A Victorian mansion from 1873. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't interrupt. The mansion belonged to the Ashford family. Mining wealth. They disappeared in 1897. Murdered, we believe, by corrupt officials who then buried the house to hide evidence. Sarah leaned forward now, attention fully engaged. "Inside the mansion," Martha said, placing the journal photocopy on the desk, "we found a vault, and inside that vault we found the Ashford fortune. Cash, gold, bonds, jewelry. Everything they owned, hidden before they were killed." Sarah picked up the journal copy, read it carefully. When she finished, her hand was shaking slightly. "You're saying you found a buried mansion with an intact fortune from 1897, and you think it's worth what, exactly?" Raymond cleared his throat. "We estimate somewhere around $265 million. The office went completely silent. Sarah Morrison stared at them for a long moment. Then she stood, walked to her window, looked out at the street below. When she turned back, her expression was unreadable. "Can you prove this? The mansion, the vault, the contents?" Martha pulled out the photographs. Sarah studied each one carefully. The mansion's exterior, partially excavated. The iron door. Interior rooms with covered furniture. The vault entrance. Open trunks showing cash and gold. Close-ups of bearer bonds and stock certificates. Sarah sat down heavily. "Holy God! Is it legal?" Raymond asked quietly. "Can we claim it?" Sarah rubbed her temples. "Okay. Legally speaking, found property generally belongs to the landowner, which is you. But property of this scale, with historical significance and potential heirs, gets complicated fast." "Are there heirs?" Martha asked. "That's what we'd need to research. Exhaustively." If there are any living descendants of the Ashfords, they'd have claims. If not, and if you can prove the property was abandoned and no rightful heirs exist, then yes, under Montana law, it's yours through right of discovery on owned land. Sarah grabbed a legal pad and started writing. But here's what happens next, and you need to be prepared. We have to authenticate everything. Bring in experts, appraisers, historians. We need documentation proving the Ashfords had no surviving heirs. We need clear chain of title on your property, and we need to immediately report this to the IRS and state tax authorities. Taxes? Raymond asked. Sarah nodded grimly. Found treasure is taxable as income. You're looking at federal income tax, possibly state taxes depending on how it's classified. Rough estimate? You might owe 40 to 50% in taxes. Martha felt the number like a physical blow, but that still leaves over $100 million. Yes, Sarah said. It does. She looked at them carefully. Mr. and Mrs. Walker, if what you're telling me is true, your lives are about to change in ways you can't imagine, and not all of them good. Are you prepared for that? Martha and Raymond looked at each other. They'd survived poverty, abandonment, and a lifetime of being overlooked. How much harder could wealth be? They had no idea. Sarah Morrison moved fast. Within 48 hours, she'd assembled a small team. A forensic accountant, a historical researcher, an appraiser who specialized in antique currency and bonds, and a tax attorney. All signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements. The researcher, a doctoral student named Marcus Chen, started digging into Ashford family genealogy. He worked 16-hour days, tracking every branch of the family tree through census records, death certificates, marriage licenses, and immigration documents. 2 weeks later, he delivered his findings in Sarah's office. Martha and Raymond sat across from him, hands clasped tight. The Ashford family line is completely extinct, Marcus said, spreading documents across the desk. James and Catherine Ashford had 3 children. Their son James Jr. died in 1897, age 32, no children. Their daughter Mary Ashford Sullivan had 2 children. Both died in childhood before 1897. Their youngest son Thomas died in 1918 during the Spanish flu pandemic. He had 1 daughter, Elizabeth, who died in 1953. Childless. So no living heirs, Sarah confirmed. None. The last person with any blood claim to the Ashford estate died 72 years ago. Sarah turned to Martha and Raymond. That means the estate is legally abandoned. The contents of that vault, under Montana statute, belong to you. The authentication process took another month. Experts descended on the property, sworn to secrecy, documenting everything. The appraiser spent 3 days in the vault, examining currency, testing gold coins, verifying bonds and stock certificates. His final report ran to 47 pages. The summary was simple. Total estimated value, $265,400,000. Martha had to sit down when she heard the number spoken aloud. Raymond just closed his eyes. Sarah filed the necessary paperwork with the IRS, the Montana Department of Revenue, and the county. She structured everything as carefully as possible, establishing a trust, minimizing tax exposure where legal, but paying what was owed. The tax bill came to $112 million. It still left them with $153 million. They signed papers in Sarah's office, their signatures shaky. When it was done, Sarah looked at them with something like concern. "You should know," she said quietly. "I filed these documents under seal, but leaks happen. Someone at the county office, the IRS, even one of the experts despite the NDAs. Word is going to get out, probably soon. Are you prepared for that?" Martha squeezed Raymond's hand. "We'll manage." But Sarah was right. Word leaked within a week. Nobody knew who talked. Maybe someone at the courthouse who saw the property transfer papers. Maybe a clerk at the IRS. Maybe just gossip from one of the graduate students who'd helped with excavation. By the 2nd week of September, the story hit social media. By the 3rd week, it was on local news. By the fourth week, national outlets were calling. Elderly couple discovers $265 million fortune in buried Victorian mansion. The phone in their cottage started ringing at 5 in the morning and didn't stop until they unplugged it. Reporters camped outside. Strangers knocked on their door at all hours. Their mailbox filled with letters from people they'd never met, asking for money, sharing sob stories, some threatening, some begging. And then their children came. Trevor arrived first, driving up from Seattle in a rental car on a Saturday morning. Martha was in the kitchen when she heard the knock. She opened the door to find her oldest son standing there, 47 years old, wearing an expensive suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mom," he said, arms spread, "can I come in?" Martha stood frozen. She hadn't seen Trevor in person for 6 years, hadn't heard his voice in 2. Behind her, Raymond appeared. "Trevor." His voice was flat. "Dad?" Trevor's smile wavered. "Look, I know it's been too long. I'm sorry. Work's been crazy, but when I heard about what you found, I just had to come see you. Make sure you're okay." He pushed past Martha into the cottage, looking around with barely concealed judgment at the space heater, the patched furniture, the walls that needed paint. "You're still living here?" he asked. "Mom, Dad, you're millionaires now. You should be in a real house." "This is a real house," Raymond said quietly. Trevor turned, his expression shifting to concern that looked rehearsed. "Look, I know this must be overwhelming, managing that kind of wealth. I work in finance. I can help. We're family." Martha found her voice. "Where were you last winter when we couldn't afford to heat more than one room?" Trevor blinked. "What? Where were you when your father needed medication and we had to choose between that and groceries? Where were you for 6 years, Trevor?" His concern melted into irritation. "Come on, Mom. I was busy. Building a career. You know how it is." "No," Raymond said, stepping forward. "We don't know how it is. How forgetting your parents is." Trevor's face hardened. "You're seriously going to guilt-trip me right now? After I drove all the way up here?" Martha felt something cold settle in her chest. "Why did you drive all the way up here, Trevor?" He didn't answer immediately. "Then to be with family, to help you navigate this." "Liar," Martha said quietly. Trevor's mouth dropped open. "Excuse me? You came because we have something valuable now, not because we're valuable to you." Before Trevor could respond, another car pulled up. Karen stepped out, her husband beside her, both looking nervous and determined. The cottage became crowded fast. Karen hugged Martha and Raymond with tears that might have been genuine. Her husband, Derek the dentist, shook hands too firmly and talked too fast about investment strategies and financial planning. "We've been so worried," Karen said, "when we heard the news. Mom, Dad, you must be terrified. All that money, all those decisions." "We're managing," Martha said. "But you shouldn't have to," Karen insisted. "That's what family is for, to help carry the burden." Raymond watched his daughter with sad eyes. "We carried plenty of burdens alone, Karen. You didn't seem interested then." Karen's face crumpled. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Raymond asked gently. The third car arrived an hour later. Michael and his wife, Stephanie. The couple who hadn't invited Martha and Raymond to their wedding. Stephanie looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Michael looked sick with shame or calculation, hard to tell which. The cottage couldn't hold all of them, so they spilled onto the tiny porch. 5 adult children and spouses, 2 elderly parents, and a conversation that was about to strip away every pretense. Trevor took charge, because of course he did. "Look, we need to talk about this practically. You're sitting on a fortune that needs proper management. I'm proposing we set up a family trust. Equal shares for everyone." "Equal shares," Martha repeated. "Well," Karen jumped in, "we're family. This is family money." Raymond's voice cut through. "This is money your mother and I found, on property we bought, that we excavated with our own hands while none of you bothered to call and see if we were alive. The children shifted uncomfortably. "Dad," Michael said quietly, "I know we messed up. I know I messed up. Especially with the wedding. I was wrong. I'm sorry." His voice cracked on that last word, and for a moment Martha softened. But then Stephanie spoke. "We all make mistakes," she said, her tone sharp. "But family forgives, family shares." Martha stared at her daughter-in-law, this woman who deemed them unworthy of witnessing her son's marriage, and something inside her, something that had been bending for months, for years, finally broke clean. "No," Martha said. "What?" Trevor asked. "No," Martha repeated louder. "You don't get to show up after abandoning us and demand a share of something you had no part in creating." "Mom," Karen started, her voice rising. "We're your children." "And we loved you," Martha said, her voice shaking. "We raised you, sacrificed for you, would have given you anything. And you walked away because we embarrassed you, because we weren't successful enough, wealthy enough, good enough for your new lives." Tears streamed down her face, but her voice stayed strong. "We were alone, truly alone. And we survived. We found that property. We excavated that mansion. We uncovered a murder that had been buried for over a century. We did that. Not you." "But you're our parents," Trevor said, and there was something ugly in his voice now. "Legally, we might have claims." Raymond stood, his full height, his surveyor's spine straight. "Get out!" "Dad," Karen pleaded, "get out of our house." Raymond's voice was iron. "All of you." "You can't be serious," Derek said. "You're going to let pride cost your children their inheritance." "You're not children," Martha said quietly. "You're adults who made adult choices. You chose to leave. We're choosing to let you stay gone." Michael stepped forward, face red. "This is insane. You're being manipulated. Probably by that lawyer. We're going to fight this." "Fight all you want," Raymond said. "The money is legally ours, and we'll spend it however we see fit." "Which won't include any of you," Martha added. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Trevor turned and stormed to his car. Karen followed, crying loudly. Derek shot them a venomous look. Stephanie grabbed Michael's arm, but he stood frozen, staring at his parents. "I really am sorry," he whispered. Martha's face softened just slightly. "I know, Michael, but sorry doesn't erase 6 years. Sorry doesn't warm a cold house or fill an empty table. Sorry is just a word." Michael nodded slowly, tears on his cheeks, and let Stephanie pull him away. Martha and Raymond stood on their porch, watching their children drive off one by one. When the last car disappeared, Raymond's legs gave out. He sat heavily on the steps. Martha joined him. "Did we just disown our children?" she asked. Raymond put his arm around her. "I think they disowned us a long time ago. We just finally acknowledged it." They sat in silence as evening settled over Montana. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, wind moved through pine trees. Life continued, indifferent to their heartbreak. That night Sarah Morrison called. Apparently Trevor's hired a lawyer, threatening to sue for elder exploitation, claiming you're not mentally competent to manage the estate. Martha closed her eyes. "Can they do that?" "They can try," Sarah said. "They won't win. You're clearly competent. We have documentation from multiple medical professionals, but it'll be ugly in public." "Let it be ugly," Martha said. "We're done hiding." The next few weeks were brutal. Trevor went to the media, painting himself as a concerned son, trying to protect elderly parents from predatory lawyers and bad decisions. Karen gave a tearful interview about how money had torn their family apart. Michael stayed silent, which somehow felt worse. Reporters dug into Martha and Raymond's life. Their poverty, their struggles, Raymond's job loss, Martha's health issues. Some stories were sympathetic. Others painted them as bitter, vindictive, choosing money over family. Martha stopped reading the news. Raymond stopped answering the phone entirely. They moved out of the cottage in early October. Sarah had found them a small house on the outskirts of Kalispell, nothing fancy, 3 bedrooms with a covered porch and a yard. They hired movers for the first time in their lives, watched strangers pack up their few belongings. The new house felt enormous compared to the cottage. Separate bedrooms, though they still slept in the same room out of habit. A kitchen with a dishwasher that actually worked. Heat in every room. Martha stood in the empty living room the first night, Raymond beside her, and cried. Not from joy or sadness, just overwhelming release. Security became necessary. After the third break-in attempt at the buried mansion, they hired a firm. Gates, cameras, guards. It felt wrong, all that protection for what amounted to an archaeological site and a family tragedy. But people were desperate, greedy, dangerous. The legal battle with Trevor dragged through November. Depositions, medical evaluations, court appearances where Martha and Raymond had to prove they were mentally sound enough to control their own lives. It was humiliating and exhausting. But Sarah was relentless. She buried Trevor's lawyers in documentation, expert testimony, evidence of Martha and Raymond's competence. In December, a judge dismissed the case with prejudice, ruling that adult children have no automatic right to their parents' assets and that the Walkers were clearly of sound mind. Trevor didn't appeal, just disappeared back to Seattle. Karen sent a card at Christmas. Brief, perfunctory. Sorry things went this way. Hope you're well. Martha put it in a drawer without responding. But Michael came back, alone this time, without Stephanie. He knocked on their door on a cold January afternoon, looking smaller somehow, diminished. I don't want money, he said when Martha answered. I just want to know if you can ever forgive me. Martha stared at her youngest child, this boy she'd carried, raised, protected, who'd broken her heart more thoroughly than his siblings because he'd been the one she thought understood. I don't know, she said honestly. Maybe someday, but not today. Michael nodded, tears in his eyes. Can I try? Can I call sometimes? Visit? Martha looked back at Raymond, who'd appeared behind her. They had a silent conversation in glances and small gestures. Once a month, Raymond said. You can call once a month. We'll see how it goes. Michael's face crumpled with relief and grief. Thank you. And he left, not pushing, not demanding, just grateful for the smallest opening. That night, Martha and Raymond sat in their new living room, a fire crackling in the fireplace they could actually afford to use. Martha was reading everything she could find about the Ashford family. Not just their deaths, but their lives. James Ashford had been controversial, yes, but also philanthropic. He'd funded schools for miners' children, helped families who lost breadwinners in cave-ins, supported the local orphanage. His wife, Catherine, had organized medical care for mining families, raised money for a community hospital that was never built. They were good people, Martha said, looking up from a yellowed newspaper article. They tried to do right by their community, and it got them killed. Raymond was studying financial documents Sarah had provided. The trust structure, the tax implications, investment strategies. It was overwhelming, managing wealth this substantial. Martha, he said slowly, what if we finished what they started? She looked at him. What do you mean? He set down the papers. The Ashfords wanted to help people, wanted to build things that mattered. Hospitals, schools, support for struggling families. They never got the chance because corrupt men stole everything and buried them. But we found it, Martha said, understanding dawning. We brought it back into the light. So maybe, Raymond continued, that's what we're supposed to do with it. Not hoard it, not spend it on ourselves. Use it the way the Ashfords would have wanted. Martha sat back, her mind racing. They'd been so focused on legal battles and their children's betrayal that they hadn't really thought about what came next, what they actually wanted to do with $153 million. She thought about the cottage where they'd nearly frozen, about choosing between heat and medicine, about all the other elderly people in similar situations, forgotten by families, struggling on social security that never stretched far enough. She thought about the Ashford children, murdered before they could grow up. about families torn apart by greed and violence then and now. "A foundation," she said slowly, "in the Ashford name, to help people like us. Seniors, struggling families, anyone the world's decided isn't worth caring about anymore." Raymond smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. Yes, exactly that. They worked through the night making lists, dreaming bigger than they'd ever allowed themselves to dream. By morning, they had the outline of something beautiful. The Ashford Foundation. Scholarships for seniors returning to school, grants for struggling families, medical debt forgiveness programs, support for abandoned elderly, funding for community centers, libraries, programs that brought people together instead of pushing them apart. "And the mansion itself," Martha said as dawn broke through their windows. "We restore it, turn it into something public. A museum, maybe. A community center. Somewhere people can learn the real story, not the lie that buried it." Raymond added to the list. "We tell James Ashford's truth. We make sure everyone knows he and his family were murdered for standing up to corruption. We give them back their names, their dignity, their legacy." Martha looked at her husband of 48 years. This man who'd stood beside her through every hardship, every heartbreak, every moment the world tried to break them. And she saw reflected in his eyes what she felt in her heart. They weren't just inheriting money. They were inheriting purpose. By March, the plans were taking shape. Sarah had connected them with architects, historians, construction firms. The buried mansion was being carefully excavated fully, every artifact preserved, every room documented. The foundation was established, board members recruited, applications for grants being developed. Martha insisted on being involved in every decision. Raymond worked with engineers on the mansion restoration, his surveyor's expertise finally valued again. They still lived modestly. The 3-bedroom house in Kalispell, one used car between them, clothes from discount stores. They didn't need luxury. They needed purpose, and purpose they had in abundance. One April morning, they stood at the excavation site watching workers carefully restore the exterior of the Ashford mansion. The building was magnificent in daylight, its Victorian architecture no longer buried in shame but gleaming with redemption. A large wooden sign was being installed at the entrance, carved letters painted in gold. Ashford Community Center and Historical Memorial, funded by Martha and Raymond Walker. In memory of those forgotten. Martha felt tears on her cheeks. Raymond's arm wrapped around her shoulders. "We did it," he whispered. "No," Martha corrected. "We're doing it. This is just the beginning." And she was right. Their children had come for money and found the door closed. But the doors of the Ashford Center would open wide for anyone who needed them, anyone who'd been told they didn't matter, anyone the world had decided to forget, because Martha and Raymond Walker knew exactly what that felt like, and they knew exactly what it took to prove the world wrong. 2 years later, the Montana spring arrived different than any spring before it. The air still carried that sharp pine scent. The snow still melted into muddy streams through the forest, but now there was something else. The sound of children laughing, the smell of fresh bread from a community kitchen, the sight of elderly folks gathered on a wraparound porch, rocking chairs creaking in rhythm with their conversation. The Ashford mansion stood magnificent against the morning sky, no longer buried in earth and shame, but restored to its 1873 glory. The slate roof gleamed. The stained glass windows caught sunlight and threw rainbows across the gardens. The iron door that had sealed secrets for over a century now stood open, welcoming, a constant invitation. Above that door, carved into new oak and gilded in gold leaf, words proclaimed what this place had become: Ashford Community Center and Historical Memorial. Below that, smaller but no less important, no one is forgotten here. Martha walked the halls every morning before the center opened, her footsteps echoing on floors that had been silent for so long. She was 78 now, her hair completely silver, her hands still shaking slightly but strong enough to hold the books she carried for her reading program. She wore comfortable shoes and a cardigan her friend Davis's wife had knitted, practical clothes for practical work. She paused in what had once been the Ashford parlour, now transformed into a library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held thousands of books, donated and purchased, organised by Martha herself using the Dewey Decimal System she'd learned 50 years ago. Comfortable chairs clustered near windows. A fireplace crackled softly, tended by volunteers. This room, where James Ashford's children had probably played, where Catherine had entertained guests, now served a different family. The forgotten, the struggling, the alone. Raymond found her there, standing by the window, lost in thought. He was 80 now, moving slower than he used to, but his surveyor's eyes were still sharp. He'd been in the workshop, teaching a group of teenagers basic carpentry. Sawdust clung to his flannel shirt. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, slipping his arm around her waist. Martha leaned into him. "I was just thinking about the first time we saw this place. Buried, hidden. Everyone said it was worthless. And now it's home to more people than it ever was when the Ashfords lived here. The community centre had opened its doors 14 months ago, after careful restoration that preserved every architectural detail while adding modern necessities. Bathrooms, a commercial kitchen, office spaces, classrooms, and that beautiful library. But it wasn't the building that made it special. It was what happened inside. Every day after school, kids flooded in. Children whose parents worked 2 or 3 jobs, who had nowhere safe to go between 3 and 7. Here they had homework help, art programs, music lessons, a warm meal, and adults who actually saw them. Martha ran a reading program 3 afternoons a week. She'd sit in the library with kids clustered around her, everyone from first graders struggling with phonics to high schoolers working through Shakespeare. She never raised her voice, never showed impatience, just endless, gentle encouragement. One girl, a 6th grader named Lucy, whose mother cleaned hotel rooms and whose father had left before she was born, had been reading at a 2nd grade level when she first came to the centre. Now, 8 months later, she was tearing through Harry Potter and asking Martha for more books about magic and belonging. Raymond taught basic home repair every Tuesday and Thursday evening. Adults mostly, but some teenagers learning skills their parents never had time to teach. How to fix a leaky faucet, patch drywall, wire a light switch safely. Practical knowledge for people living paycheck to paycheck who couldn't afford to call a plumber. His students ranged from elderly widows whose husbands had always handled repairs to young single fathers learning to maintain the homes they were desperately trying to keep. Raymond taught with patience shaped by 78 years of living, never making anyone feel stupid for not knowing, always celebrating small victories. The kitchen served lunch daily, dinner 3 times a week, not charity, not handouts. Community meals where everyone contributed something, even if it was just showing up and eating together. The chef was a woman named Rosa, who'd lost her restaurant in a fire and found purpose here, cooking for people who reminded her why she'd fallen in love with food in the first place. Seniors came daily, some dropped off by families who visited regularly, others arriving alone, abandoned by children who'd moved away or moved on. They gathered in what had been the Ashford dining room, now fitted with comfortable chairs, card tables, a television, bookshelves. They played gin rummy and watched game shows and talked about their lives, their memories, their stubborn refusal to simply fade away. Martha made sure every senior who came through the doors was greeted by name. She kept notes on birthdays, medication schedules, favorite foods, grandchildren's names. She made them visible when the world had decided they were invisible. The 2nd floor housed classrooms for adult education, GED preparation, computer literacy, English as a second language. In the East Wing, job training programs partnered with local businesses. Welding, hospitality, bookkeeping, certified nursing assistant courses. But the crown jewel was the historical memorial. James Ashford's study had been preserved exactly as found, dust removed but otherwise untouched. His desk, his books, his papers under glass. The journal with its final entry displayed prominently, telling the truth about a family murdered for standing against corruption. Visitors could walk through reconstructed rooms, read the Ashford story, understand what had been buried and why. School groups came regularly, learning local history that textbooks had erased. The murdered family finally had their names restored, their legacy honored, their truth told. And every visitor learned that the center existed because two elderly people had refused to accept that land everyone else called worthless was actually worthless, had dug when everyone told them to quit, had believed in something buried when the world insisted it should stay that way. The Ashford Foundation, established with $150 million, worked quietly behind the scenes. Sarah Morrison, still their lawyer and now a close friend, sat on the board. Dr. Helen Chen, the historian who'd authenticated the mansion, directed the historical preservation programs. Davis, Raymond's old friend, managed the property maintenance with a crew of paid workers and volunteers. But the foundation's real work happened in individual lives, transformed one at a time. Scholarships sent 63 seniors back to school in the first year alone. People in their 60s and 70s and 80s finally pursuing degrees they'd dreamed of for decades. Martha personally reviewed every application, looking for the same stubborn determination she recognized in herself. Grants went to families on the edge of collapse. A single mother whose car died and who couldn't get to work. A disabled veteran facing eviction. A couple caring for a special needs child while drowning in medical debt. Small amounts, usually, 500 here, 2,000 there. Enough to stop the spiral, provide breathing room, offer hope. The medical debt forgiveness program worked with local hospitals, quietly paying off bills for people who'd never catch up on their own. Hundreds of families received letters saying their debt had been cleared. Many never knew where the money came from, just that suddenly the crushing weight had lifted. And through it all, Martha and Raymond lived modestly. Their 3-bedroom house in Kalispell, one 10-year-old Subaru, clothes from Goodwill, meals often eaten at the community center alongside everyone else. They drew a small salary from the foundation, enough to live comfortably but not extravagantly. The remaining money, carefully invested and managed, generated enough income to sustain the center and the foundation indefinitely. This wasn't a temporary charity that would disappear when the money ran out. This was legacy, built to outlast them. As for their children, the aftermath had been exactly as painful as expected. Trevor had tried to sue twice more, claiming undue influence, financial exploitation, even attempting to have them declared incompetent through a different jurisdiction. Each time Sarah had crushed the case and each defeat had made Trevor more bitter. He hadn't spoken to them in 18 months. Martha had seen his Facebook page once, photos of him with his family at expensive restaurants on tropical vacations, his kids, their grandchildren, growing up without knowing them. It hurt, but not the way it once would have. Martha had grieved that relationship, laid it to rest like you'd grieve any death. Trevor had made his choice. She couldn't fix it, couldn't force it, could only accept it and move forward. Karen had sent a letter 6 months after the legal battles ended. 4 pages, handwritten, full of justifications and half apologies. She understood their disappointment, but felt they were being harsh. Family was supposed to forgive. Love was supposed to be unconditional. Didn't they want a relationship with their grandchildren? Martha had responded with her own letter, shorter, kinder than Karen probably deserved. We do love you unconditionally, but love doesn't mean enabling behavior that hurts us. You're welcome in our lives when you're ready to see us as people, not as sources of inheritance or obligation. Until then, we wish you well. Mom. Karen hadn't responded, but she did send Christmas cards now, and sometimes she called brief, uncomfortable conversations where neither of them said what they really meant. Maybe someday it would heal. Maybe not. Martha had made peace with both possibilities. Michael was different. True to his word, he'd called once a month. Awkward conversations at first, stilted, both sides afraid of saying the wrong thing. But slowly, painfully, something like trust began rebuilding. He came to visit in person every few months, always alone. Stephanie had filed for divorce 8 months ago, apparently unable to accept that Michael's parents weren't going to fund their lifestyle. The divorce had devastated Michael, but it had also clarified something. Showed him who'd actually loved him versus who'd loved what he might inherit. He'd started therapy, he told Martha one afternoon while they walked the grounds of the center, working through his shame, his choices, his desperate need for approval from people who measured worth in dollars. "I don't want anything from you," he'd said, not for the first time. "I just want to know you, want my kids to know their grandparents. If you'll let them." Martha and Raymond were cautious, but they'd started meeting Michael's children. Carefully supervised visits, ice cream trips, walks through town. The kids were young enough not to understand the complicated history, just knew they had grandparents who asked about their lives and listened to their answers. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more fragile and harder won. It was choosing to try again, knowing full well it might not work, but believing the effort mattered more than the outcome. One Thursday afternoon in late April, Martha was in the library helping a struggling reader when she noticed commotion near the entrance. A middle-aged woman had arrived, practically dragging an elderly man beside her. The man looked confused, frightened, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. Martha excused herself and approached gently. The woman was crying, trying to hide it, her voice shaking. "I don't know where else to take him," she said. "My father. My brothers put him in a nursing home 6 months ago, haven't visited once. They said he was too much trouble, cost too much money. But the home is awful, understaffed. He's lost 20 pounds. He just sits in his room all day and nobody talks to him." The elderly man, maybe 85, stared at the floor. "I got him out," the woman continued. "Told the home I was taking him for the day, but I can't take him home. My husband says we can't afford it, don't have room. My brothers won't help. I don't know what to do. I heard this place helps people who have nowhere else to go." Martha looked at the man, really looked at him. Saw the hollow eyes, the defeated posture, the absolute certainty that he was a burden nobody wanted. She'd seen that look in the mirror often enough to recognize it anywhere. Martha knelt down, bringing herself to his eye level, and took his trembling hand in both of hers. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Walter," he whispered. "Walter, I'm Martha. This is the Ashford Center, and you're not forgotten here. None of us are." His eyes finally met hers, and something in them cracked. Tears spilled down weathered cheeks. Martha squeezed his hand. "Are you hungry, Walter? Would you like some lunch? We're having Rosa's chicken soup today, and it's the best in Montana." He nodded, unable to speak. Martha stood, helped Walter to his feet, and guided him toward the dining room. Over her shoulder, she said to the daughter, "Stay, we'll figure this out together." And they did. By the end of the day, they'd connected Walter's daughter with legal aid to challenge the guardianship her brothers had claimed. Connected Walter with the senior program, got him enrolled in the daily activities, arranged for transportation, made sure he had a place to belong while the legal issues sorted themselves out. 2 weeks later, Walter was there every day. He played cards with other seniors, helped in the garden Raymond had started, and slowly, gradually, came back to life. His daughter visited regularly, no longer alone in caring for him. Martha watched him laugh at something another resident said and felt that familiar ache in her chest. Not pain exactly, more like purpose made physical. This is why, she thought. This is why we found that money. Not for us. For Walter. For Lucy struggling with reading. For Rosa who lost her restaurant. For every person who thought they were finished, used up, forgotten. In June, a local news station did a follow-up story. Not about the money this time, but about what had been built with it. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica, spent 3 days at the center, interviewing staff and visitors, filming activities. She sat with Martha and Raymond in the library for the final interview, cameras rolling. "You've given away almost all of it," Jessica said. $150 million. You could have lived like royalty. Why didn't you? Martha and Raymond exchanged glances. Raymond answered first. "Because we know what it's like to be invisible, to be dismissed as irrelevant just because you're old or poor, or not what society deems valuable. We spent years feeling like we didn't matter. We couldn't take that money and forget everyone else who feels the same way." The reporter turned to Martha. "Your own children aren't part of this. They challenged you legally. Some have cut off contact. Do you regret how things turned out with them?" Martha was quiet for a moment, choosing words carefully. "We regret that they chose money over love. We regret that they couldn't see us as people worthy of respect without wealth attached. But we don't regret choosing purpose over bitterness. We don't regret building something that helps people instead of hoarding what we found." Jessica leaned forward. "What would you say to them if you could say anything?" Raymond cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd say we loved you. We still love you. But love doesn't mean letting ourselves be used or disrespected. You taught us, without meaning to, that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. But it also taught us that family can be built, not just born into." Martha added softly, "We were forgotten by our family, but we found a new family in our community, and that family shows up every single day, not because of what we have, but because of who we are to each other." The interview went viral. Within days, millions had watched the elderly couple who'd chosen community over children, purpose over profit. Some comments were cruel, calling them heartless, unnatural, bitter. But most were supportive, from other people who'd been abandoned by families, who understood that blood ties don't justify abuse or exploitation. Donations poured in, unsolicited. The foundation had to hire staff just to process them. People wanted to be part of what the Walkers had built, wanted to support a vision that valued the forgotten. But Martha and Raymond stayed grounded. They still showed up every day, still ran their programs, still learned the names of every person who walked through those doors. Fame didn't change them because they'd already been changed by something deeper, by the work itself. One evening in late August, after the center had closed and volunteers had cleaned up, Martha and Raymond stood on the wraparound porch of the mansion. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Children's laughter still seemed to echo in the air, even though the kids had gone home hours ago. Martha leaned against the railing, looking out over gardens where vegetables grew in neat rows, tended by seniors and teenagers working side by side. She thought about that first day they'd seen this property, overgrown and supposedly cursed, the depression in the earth that Raymond had recognized as something more. "You remember that first night we went down into the vault?" she asked. Raymond joined her at the railing, his arms settling around her shoulders in the familiar way of 5 decades together. "How could I forget? Finding all that money, reading James Ashford's last words. We didn't sleep for days." Martha smiled. "You said something. We were sitting on that stone floor surrounded by trunks full of gold and cash, and you said maybe we were meant to find this. Not for us, but for others like us." Raymond nodded slowly. "I remember. I didn't know then how right I was." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the light fade. From inside the mansion, they could hear Rosa closing up the kitchen, humming something soft and melodic. A car pulled up the long driveway, headlights cutting through dusk. Martha watched the car park. A young couple got out, maybe late 20s, looking nervous and uncertain. They stood by their vehicle, a beat-up sedan held together with prayer and duct tape, staring at the mansion like it might bite them. The woman held a baby. Couldn't have been more than a few months old. The man carried a toddler on his hip. Both adults looked exhausted, defeated, like they'd reached the end of options and were here as a last desperate attempt. Martha straightened, her purpose sensor activating. Raymond squeezed her shoulder gently, then stepped back. This was her gift, this welcoming of the wounded. She descended the porch steps carefully, her old knees protesting but holding. She walked across the gravel toward the young couple, her face open and kind. The woman saw her coming and clutched the baby tighter, defensive. The man set down the toddler but kept a protective hand on the child's shoulder. Martha stopped a respectful distance away. "Evening," she said gently. "Can I help you?" The woman's voice shook. "We saw the news story about this place. We don't have anywhere else to go." Martha took a small step closer. "What's your name?" "Emma," the woman whispered. "This is my husband, Jake. Our kids are Lily and Jack." Martha smiled, the kind of smile that said, "You're safe here. You're seen here." "Well, Emma and Jake and Lily and Jack, I'm Martha. Welcome to the Ashford Center." "We don't have money," Jake said quickly, almost defensively. "We can't pay for anything." Martha's smile didn't waver. "Good thing everything here is free then. Are you hungry? Have the kids eaten?" Emma's composure cracked. She shook her head, tears spilling. "We've been living in the car for 3 days. Jake lost his job when the mill closed. We got evicted. We don't know what to do. We're trying to get to my sister in Oregon, but we ran out of gas money." Martha's heart, that stubborn old heart that had survived so much, expanded with familiar purpose. "Come inside. Rosa's probably still got soup on. We'll get the babies fed, get you both fed. Then we'll figure out next steps together." "But we're not charity cases," Jake said, pride warring with desperation. "No one here is," Martha replied firmly. "We're all just people who need help sometimes. Today it's you. Tomorrow it might be me. That's how community works." She held out her hand. Emma stared at it for a long moment, then slowly reached out. Martha's grip was warm, steady, anchored. "Come in," Martha said softly. "You're home." Raymond watched from the porch as Martha guided the young family toward the mansion, the building that had been buried in shame and resurrected in purpose. He saw her stop at the door, saw her point to the words carved above it, saw Emma reading them aloud, her voice barely audible but full of desperate hope. "No one is forgotten here." Raymond's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears, proud tears. They'd started with $1,200 and a plot of cursed land. They'd found $265 million and a truth buried for a century. They'd lost their children but gained a community. They'd been dismissed as irrelevant but had built something that would outlive them by generations. The greatest treasure, Raymond realized, wasn't the gold in that vault or the cash in those trunks. It was this moment, watching his wife of 50 years welcome strangers into shelter, into dignity, into belonging. It was knowing that every person who walked through those doors would be seen, valued, remembered. It was understanding that forgotten people the world had written off, often remembered most clearly what actually mattered. Not wealth or status or approval, but connection, purpose, and the simple radical act of refusing to be invisible. Rosa emerged from the mansion, saw the new family, and immediately went into action. She disappeared back inside, and within minutes lights were on in the dining room. Volunteers started arriving, called by some mysterious grapevine that always seemed to know when someone needed help. By the time Raymond walked back inside, Emma and Jake were seated at a table with their children, bowls of soup steaming in front of them. Lily, the baby, had been taken by a grandmother volunteer who rocked her gently while Emma ate. Jack, the toddler, was already playing with toys in the children's corner, his earlier anxiety forgotten. Martha caught Raymond's eye across the room. He nodded to her, a whole conversation in that small gesture. "Yes, we did good. Yes, this matters. Yes, we'd do it all again, exactly the same way. That night, long after Emma and Jake had been set up in temporary housing through one of the Foundation's emergency programs, long after every volunteer had gone home and the mansion stood quiet, Martha and Raymond walked the halls one last time. They paused in James Ashford's study, the memorial room. His journal sat under glass, open to that final entry. Martha read the words she'd memorized, but never tired of seeing. Let them take the house. Let them take our lives if they must. But they won't take what I've built for my children and grandchildren. Time will decide who deserves it. She looked at Raymond. We deserved it. Not because we were special, but because we understood what it meant to be robbed of dignity. And we used it the way he would have wanted, Raymond added. We gave it back, gave it forward. They walked to the front door, preparing to lock up. Through the windows, they could see the gardens, the parking lot, the long driveway leading back to the world. In the morning, it would fill again with people. Children needing homework help, seniors needing companionship, adults needing job training, families needing hope. And Martha and Raymond would be here as they were every day, not as saviors or heroes or even benefactors. Just as two old people who'd learned that being forgotten by some meant having the freedom to be remembered by others. Who'd learned that wealth meant nothing without purpose. Who'd learned that the best legacy wasn't what you left behind, but what you built that kept growing after you were gone. Martha locked the door, tested it twice to make sure it was secure. Raymond took her hand and they walked to their car, that practical 10-year-old Subaru, for the drive back to their modest 3-bedroom house. The stars were out, brilliant against the Montana darkness. The same stars that had watched a family be murdered and buried. The same stars that had watched 2 elderly people dig through a century of lies. The same stars that now looked down on a community center blazing with purpose. We spent our whole lives feeling invisible, Martha said as they drove through the quiet night. Now look at us. Raymond kept his eyes on the road, but his voice was rich with contentment. We're not invisible. We never were. We were just waiting for our moment. And what a moment it's been, Martha said softly. They drove in silence for a while, comfortable and companionable. Then Raymond spoke again, thoughtful. You think we'll be remembered after we're gone? Martha considered this. She thought about Lucy reading above grade level, about Walter laughing at card games, about Emma and Jake getting help before desperation turned to tragedy, about 63 seniors pursuing delayed dreams, about hundreds of families freed from crushing debt. I think the Ashfords will be remembered, she finally said. Their real story, not the lie that buried them. And I think people will remember that 2 old folks decided to finish what they started. That's enough? Raymond asked. Martha smiled. That's everything. They pulled into their driveway, the little house dark and waiting. Tomorrow they'd wake early, return to the center, do it all again. Run programs, welcome strangers, build community one connection at a time. But tonight, they sat in the car for just a moment longer, holding hands. 2 people in their late 70s who'd been told their lives were over, their purpose spent, their value depleted. 2 people who'd proven that sometimes the story doesn't end where everyone expects. Sometimes it's just beginning, buried under earth and lies and the world's dismissal, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig. Sometimes the forgotten ones are the ones who remember what everyone else chose to forget. That wealth isn't money. That legacy isn't inheritance. That value isn't determined by the young or the successful or the comfortable. That sometimes the people society throws away are exactly the people who know how to build something worth keeping. Martha and Raymond Walker had bought worthless land for $1,200. They'd found a murdered family's fortune. They'd lost their children but gained a community. They'd been dismissed as irrelevant but had built something that mattered more than anything they'd ever imagined. And as they finally walked into their house, turned on the lights, and began preparing for bed in the routine of 50 years together, They knew with absolute certainty that they'd made the right choice. Not the easy choice, not the expected choice, but the right one. Anyone can change the world if they're stubborn enough to stand their ground and brave enough to speak the truth. Anyone can build a legacy if they stop measuring worth in dollars and start measuring it in lives touched, dignity restored, hope rekindled. As the morning sun warmed the stone walls of the Ashford Community Center, Martha Walker didn't reach for wealth or recognition. She reached for the hand of a stranger who needed to know they mattered. She reached for the book a child struggled to read. She reached for the forgotten, the overlooked, the cast aside. Because she knew exactly what it felt like to be all of those things, and she knew exactly what it took to prove the world wrong. The mechanic's daughter who'd become a librarian, the surveyor who'd lost his job. Two people society had decided were finished. Two people who'd found a buried fortune and chosen to give it away. Two people who'd learned that the greatest treasure was never the gold in the vault or the cash in the trunks. It was purpose. It was community. It was the radical act of seeing value where everyone else saw waste. For Martha and Raymond and everyone who walked through the doors of the Ashford Center, the story wasn't about money. It was about redemption, not just for a murdered family whose truth had been buried for 127 years, but for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't matter. Because at the Ashford Center, built by two forgotten people who refused to stay buried, everyone mattered, everyone belonged, everyone was home. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories of hope, heart, and second chances. Click to continue the journey with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some people are underestimated for a reason, so they can prove everyone wrong.